So Rachel, why don't you kick it off and then I'll take it over.
Sure, great. All right, I want to thank you all for being here with us today for our online poetry session, The Refuge of Witnessing, with our poet, Lawrence Raab. So Lawrence is the author of 9 books of poems, including Mistaking Each Other for Ghosts, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and named one of the 10 best poetry books of 2015 by the New York Times. An earlier collection, What We Don't Know About Each Other, was a winner of the National Poetry Series and a finalist for the National Book Award. His most recent book of poems is The Life Beside This One. He is also the co-author with Stephen Dunn of a chapbook of collaborative poems, Winter at the Caspian Sea. In 2016, Tupelo published his collected essays, Why Don't We Say What We Mean? And a new collection of poems, April at the Ruins, was published in March of 2022. He is the Harry C. Payne Professor of Poetry Emeritus at Williams College, where he taught for 42 years. So thank you very much for being here with us today, Lawrence.
Well, thank you. And actually, the most recent book now that it's out is this one, April at the Ruins. So, and this is number 10. So that note that you have was written before the book came out.
Yeah, Larry, I should make a joke. April at the Ruins. I think that's about the stock market, right?
It could be about a lot of things, right? But definitely the stock market, though. Yeah. I don't have a stock market poem in here.
Yeah. No, Rachel, thanks for starting us off. Wendy's on vacation this week. And no, Larry, thanks for coming back again this year.
I'm happy.
So we always start out, what does refuge mean to you?
Well, I was thinking about that. I think it means the 2 different kinds of things that are linked. So on the one hand, it's an escape particularly from danger, someone seeking refuge. But on the other hand, it's a retreat, which doesn't necessarily involve danger, but a kind of absenting of oneself from the noise and distractions of ordinary life. So if you think of like a wildlife refuge, or an artist colony, which I've often gone to, you go there in order to concentrate, to meditate, to work, and that meaning doesn't involve actual being in danger, but the other sense of it does. So there are 2 aspects that somehow interact with each other.
And do you, I guess on the escape side, which is maybe what a bunch of people might have done during the pandemic, do you see people kind of leaving their refuges, and there's all this talk about, getting back in the world, going out?
Well, yeah, that would be the danger part. I mean, it was dangerous to go out, and still is in many ways. So then your house becomes your refuge, and for many people, eventually a kind of burden to be confined in that way. So that's very much the opposite then of seeking a refuge in order to to be at home there, to work, to feel somehow at ease with one's imagination. I know a lot of people during the pandemic, a lot of artists and writers felt at the beginning, well, I'm going to be confined here and therefore I'll do a lot of work. And a lot of those people then found that they didn't. And I certainly didn't. I think it's the maybe, I don't know exactly what it was, kind of lack of variety, perhaps, a sense of a confinement that wasn't chosen, an awareness of the world as being a dangerous place, perhaps all of those things.
No, it's interesting how you portray that as you're seeking refuge, and then it becomes kind of your prison,
Yes.
and you can't, everything you want, you're all wanted, but you're behind a locked door and you can't get out. I mean, obviously you can get out, but that's just interesting view.
Well, I think that's probably true in a very literal way, though, for a refugee from, say, the Ukraine. Where do you go? Your life has been in many ways taken away from you. Your country has been taken away from you, and people try to help you, but you have still lost so much that you are being placed in a position where it is a little bit like a prison. If it's a prison that's protecting you from danger, it still is a kind of prison.
Yeah. So do you have some poems to share with us that would touch on that subject?
Yes, I do. And this is just before I read the first poem, I was thinking there's a sentence of 4 lines in a poem by my friend Stephen Dunn. The poem is called Mercy. The sentence that stuck out for me was this: sometimes escape can be an art, or a selfishness, or just a gift you need to give yourself. And the first poem I read, I think, has to do with that. It's also happens to be dedicated to Stephen Dunn. It's called A Little Music. Then it seemed that all of the poems about death had been written, and all of the poems about the future had finally exhausted us with the truth of their lamentations. What is left for me now? The poet asks, still hoping to give someone the chance to walk out into a meadow of improbable beauty, or through the streets of an ancient city, the windows open, the murmur of voices mixing with the murmur of the sea. This is the moment the poem wants to leave us with. The men and women of that place lying in each other's arms as sleep offers them its consolations, and a little music arrives from far away. So I think of that. I mean, Stephen speaks of a gift you need to give yourself. In this poem, the poet wishes to give a kind of gift through the poem to others, that sense of improbable beauty, which by the end of the poem becomes the consolations of sleep.
Well, I like the when all the poems about death have been written. I think that's
Yes.
Is that going to put a lot of poets out of business now? Only kidding.
I suppose they never will be written. Never all of them, but sometimes it seems that way. It's hard to say anything new about that subject. A kind of companion poem to that is this next poem, which is called False Dawn. And as you all may know, false dawn is that hour or so before the actual rising of the sun. When I looked it up the other day to see what an actual definition of it would be, it said the hour or so of thin light before the actual rising of the sun. And I thought that was thin light. That seemed quite beautiful to me. So the false dawn. The monasteries were closed. The monks who remained lit candles to pretend the darkness wasn't permanent. And some were troubled in the false dawn. Had loving God become too difficult? Silence enfolded them. In this way, they were like us, as we lie in bed, sleepless, watching the headlights of cars slide across the ceiling, remembering when we took our lives for granted. The monks had been taught to welcome death. What was there to lose except the body and its troublesome secrets and needs? They lit their candles because they always had, and because repetition is a comfort, the shape of a day falling into place as if it belonged to us. So the monastery kind of, obviously a kind of refuge for the monks. And I think refuge is also here indicated by repetition. Repetition becomes a way of recognizing an order in things, or a way of predicting order, of organizing one's life, of recognizing in the final line the shape of a day falling into place, but tentatively so, as if it belonged to us. So the poem doesn't claim too much, but
What I like is, I think that one line, had loving God become too hard or too much? Wow.
yeah.
Talk about your refuge blowing up. I'm in a monastery and okay, that phase is over.
That's right. Yes. Well, and that's paired with the line about remembering when we took our lives for granted.
Yeah, I know.
That's the way we feel when we're younger than 75, when we're much younger, and life just seems to be what you expect to happen, unimpeded by anything.
Yeah.
So I have a third.
Yeah, great.
This one, this is called After the Sky Had Fallen. And it has a number of different elements. The title refers to the story of Chicken Little, the sky falling. And that goes on just for a few lines. And then the poem turns to the story of the Magi bringing their gifts to Christ. And then after that, moves into a Grimm's fairy tale, one that would be very like Hansel and Gretel. So I think I've made things up for my grim story. After the sky had fallen, at the beginning, a foolish mistake. At the end, the fox eats them all. After which the thatch of night surrounds the lost children, who sometimes find their way home and sometimes do not, while the stars turn into maps, which is how the wise men were guided. They set their gifts in the straw before the manger and stepped back. One of them thought, but what use can the child have for such things? Yet the firelight loved those treasures and would not leave them alone until they found their place in the story. Meanwhile, the children walk deeper into the forest. Surely God will help us, the boy tells his sister. No, she replies. The world has abandoned us. Whereupon an old woman steps out of the shadowy trees. Dear ones, she exclaims, how thin you are. Come to my cottage and I will give you pancakes and apples. Of course, the children follow her because they cannot see she is a terrible witch who plans to cook them in the morning and eat them for supper. But that night, she tucks them gently into bed and kisses them just as their mother had. Or else, a snow white bird watches those children sleeping in the cold forest and is touched by their dreams and sings so sweet a song that when the children wake, they believe this music will guide them through the great maze of trees until they arrive at a meadow where they will look up to see the familiar stars, and not far away, a little house, so much like home, they cannot help but think, surely we will be happy now.
Wow, quite the journey there.
Yes, well, there are obviously two possibilities that I'm offering for the story. One is the witch, and the other is salvation by the snow white bird, or the music of its song, kind of connected to the other poem, which I hadn't noticed until now. But it seems important to me that everything at the end of the poem about their being saved and return to, let's say, their refuge from the dangers of the woods, all that is imagined. The children wake up, they believe that this music will guide them. It hasn't yet done anything, though the poem describes it. So in some ways, that's the story. It's there. It happens, but it doesn't happen. The poem wants to have it both ways. Another as if kind of proposition.
Wow, very interesting. So Larry, let's just take a little, we have a little break during each section, and we ask the audience if they'd like to ask you questions. I think Donna knows, I always say, don't let the poet off easy. Let's ask the tough questions, or any questions. We just like to have some audience interaction. So if anybody has a question, you could put it in the chat if you don't want to say it, or you could unmute. Anybody? Donna?
Yes, well, I'm really enjoying your poetry. You seem to be a poet storyteller, which I find really fascinating, that you pull something out of a children's story and turn it into something so different and really quite beautiful. So I just wonder, what is your muse, or do you have several?
Well, I have several muses.
Yeah.
Well, I have my wife, who there she is. She's a muse. My friends, Raleigh, he helped make the poems as good as they can be. I think, I mean, the idea of storytelling is, I think, important in my poems. There are a lot of stories. There are a lot of different stories. I think what appeals to me initially is the tone of voice that a character might have. A lot of my poems begin not with like an idea, not even with an actual whole story, but with a character, a speaker who speaks in a certain way. And I think that's interesting. That sentence is interesting. That tone is interesting. What else would this speaker have to say? And then I try to follow that. So that's one of the pleasures of writing, discovering what it is that you do have to say rather than beginning with it.
Very interesting. I also think that, you know, some of your language, like the shape of the day, and some of the things that you thought about, like the false dawn, how the air around you, how does that inspire you? Just having an idea of, you know, something like the moon or the sun or well, like the shape of the day. How does, I mean, if you could explain, like, how does the environment around you inspire you?
I guess I'd have to say, well, not very much. I think it's really, I mean, you're thinking about like the physical world, that, you know, walking outside and seeing this or that. I mean, sometimes that can get a poem started, but I think a poem starts with, for me, some kind of gesture of language, which is striking and interesting and seems like it could go somewhere. But once the poem starts going somewhere, then it can accumulate materials from all over the place, from outside. You start to think, well, the poem could use this, or it could steal this from someplace else. And that process of accumulation is, I think, also like a process of seeing things, as you put it.
Thank you.
So Larry, let me just follow up, you know, on what Donna said. You know, those lines that you start, you know, whether it's a gesture of language, do those lines like come to you like a stock market ticker or something? They're flying across your forehead, or I'm just wondering, are they rain down from the heavens, or?
That's a very interesting question, and I have a very specific answer to that, which is that I go and look for them. And one of the ways that I do that, that I come to do that, is that I read a newspaper, usually not the articles that are the important articles, but articles in the back pages. And I'm just looking for things that I only read what's in quotes, just things that people say. And if any of them, and they always do, you always find things that are said in interesting ways. And then I just underline them and or type them up. And I keep a list of all of these, an accumulation, until I've forgotten their source. I'm not at all interested in the actual story. I'm only interested in those sentences. And then I start reading through the ones I have until I come upon one that wants to take me somewhere. You know, someone is saying something usually to someone else at a particular moment for a particular reason. All of that I don't know yet. So all of that is something that the poem can discover. And it's that sense, as I said a few minutes ago, of discovering something, discovering in ways the story behind, making up the story behind what it is that this person has said that interests me.
Yeah, Judith, I think he answered your question. Judith put something in chat. When you start a poem, do you usually know where it's going? I think you just answered with it that there's a whole discovery process that unfolds as the poem matures. And
yeah, I never know where it's going when I start it. And I want it to be that way. Wouldn't be any fun if I knew where it was going. If I knew what the idea behind the poem was, the act of writing the poem becomes something like translation. It's like there's a poetic vocabulary, and I have to fit my idea into it. So no, that's not what I want to do.
so Barbara Goldberg put in the chat, how do you and Stephen work collaboratively together?
Can I just say something? I think you'll find it interesting that I went to high school with Stephen. He was the star of the basketball team and I was captain of the cheerleaders.
Wow.
And then we both became poets.
Oh.
But I know you used to coordinate your time, was it in Yaddo together? And I wonder how that relationship worked to inspire each other.
Well, in lots of different ways. It was a very important relationship for many, many years. As people here may know, Stephen died not too long ago. But for a very long time, we would arrange to go to our refuge together, to either Yaddo or McDowell, and work and show each other our work several times a day, offer suggestions. But we would also give each other assignments. And I think I'll read one of those assignment poems in the next section of this. So, but the assignments would sometimes be quite difficult. And that one assignment that Stephen gave me once was write the poem that can't be written. And
oh boy.
And the poem is called The Poem That Can't Be Written. I thought, okay, the best way of dealing with that assignment is just to steal the line and talk about the poem that can't be written. So I enjoyed doing that, but we would sometimes exchange lines. We did a little book of collaborative poems together. So we did a lot of things, and it was a great loss.
Did you play ping pong with him?
I played tennis with him mainly until he could no longer play tennis. He had Parkinson's.
Right.
I have played ping pong with him, but he was much too good for me, and it wasn't our game. Tennis worked better because he would always beat me, always. But I could still make some shots. And,
Do you mind if I ask you, sir, when you do go, I mean, I have so many questions, but when you go back to, or do you ever go back to older poems? Like you mentioned, the poem that can't be written, that's in the history of forgetting.
yes, yes.
And if you do, what are your thoughts like? I mean, I know when I go back to poems that I wrote way in the beginning, I go anywhere from who wrote that to that's really shitty to well, that holds up pretty good. That's not bad. So like a poem like the poem that can't be written or the great poem is in that book.
Right.
When you read those, your reaction?
Both of those hold up pretty well for me. I like the poem that can't be written, especially. I think the great poem deserved to be a little funnier than it came out. But yeah, I mean,
It's always in the anthologies, that poem.
I know. But I think you covered the ground there. You look back at something early and you think, oh God, how did I write that? Someone should have told me not to publish that. But then sometimes you think, gee, that's good. And you think sometimes that's better than I thought that it was. And that really is that's a kind of pleasure. Then you think, well, why didn't I recognize that? Maybe I'm not being sharp enough about my own poems.
You know, I always tend to think, you know, you're a different person every, 10 years of your life. A different person wrote that poem.
That's true. Yeah.
Larry,
Interesting. Thank you.
let's move on. Any other questions? I don't want to cut anybody off. We're going to move on to the second half. So,
Okay.
what does witnessing mean to you?
Well, I think it is essentially a kind of seeing, but it's not just like seeing anything. I mean, if you go outside and there's a beautiful sunset, you don't think I'm witnessing the sunset. You think I'm seeing it. So that to witness something, well, in the sense of if you're called as a witness, you have seen something important that has to be reported. And if you see, let's say, an atrocity in wartime, there's a kind of moral pressure to communicate this, either by reporting it or by photographing it, by writing a poem about it. Those become acts of witnessing. And you're always saying that one is saying, those people who have experienced that, you're saying, well, I was there, I saw this, you should see what I saw. There's a short 4-line poem by Anna Akhmatova called Requiem, and it goes, no foreign sky protected me, no stranger's wing shielded my face. I stand as witness to the common lot, survivor of that time, that place. And indeed she was. And many poets who, like Mandelstam and so on, their poems became acts of witnessing. I have never written a poem like that. I've never been in that kind of important and perilous position. So I can think about it, as John has prompted me to, but it's not, and I can write about it. And I will read a poem or two that are about, I think, witnessing, though that's not probably the way I thought of it when I wrote the poem.
Well, the question I usually have every week is, are we approaching witnessing overload? Being bombarded with news, the internet, all sorts. I tell you, I just feel like it's a Tim Burton movie or something, but it's real.
Yeah, that's a real danger for any, well, certainly for any artist. If people have seen so much, then what else can you say? All the poems about death have been written. What else is there to add them? All the lamentations about the future. Is there anything new to say about the apocalypses that await us? But I think what the poet Ilya Kaminsky, and I don't have the quote at hand, but he's Ukrainian, and he's been very much interviewed these days. He's a fine poet, but when asked about sort of writing the political poem or the poem of witness, he seems always to make the point that the aim of the poem is to work on the reader's imagination, to change you by, in some ways, making you think more clearly about anything that's going on in the world. It's not necessarily to convince you to act in a certain way. I mean, there are certainly poems that have that in mind, and sometimes they're very good poems. But it does mean that the aim of a poem is, in some ways, to affect the way that that you are capable of seeing the world. Robert Frost says that one of the aim of great art is to raise trouble and sorrow to a higher plane of regard. And he said it's not to make it better or to get over it. It's to raise it to a higher plane of regard, to see it, to see one's life, one's place in the world more clearly. And I think that's what all poems or all art that is serious attempts to do, to not to change our mind, but to focus our minds.
Nice, great interpretation. Do you want to share some poems?
I do. As I said, since I cannot claim to have written a poem of witness, I want to read one that is. It was written by a student of mine named Charles Scott. It's in this book, which is a terrific book called Soft Water. And Scotty, as he was known, was a Marine in Vietnam in 1968, which is probably the worst time to have been in Vietnam. He witnessed a great deal, and it affected him. He died in 2017 of cancer, which was probably brought on by Agent Orange. But I do want to read a poem of his, which is just, it's a terrific poem, but it is a poem of witnessing, and in many ways a complicated poem. It's also a story. So it's called Load of Ice Near Amlock. Some men were killed on the ice run from Da Nang back at Finger 5 on the river overlooking Ambush Alley during Tet. Staff Sergeant Jackson had traded a pile of captured weapons for 20 cases of beer. Everyone was tired of warm beer, which meant someone had to take a truck and make a run to the ice plant in Da Nang. The captain wanted a corporal. He wanted me. I argued with Sergeant Jackson, but there always has got to be a senior NCO in charge. That was the whole problem. I didn't want to be in charge, to be responsible for any more men. I had already decided by then that if I made it through the war, I was never again going to be in charge of anything. But the captain wanted a corporal, and I went into Da Nang. We left early, made several other stops, then picked up the ice and started back in the middle of the afternoon. I didn't make any mistakes. I knew they were out there, the Dock Lap Battalion. But they were quick and clean and gone before the pieces stopped falling. After everything had settled, it was quiet because there were no wounded. Everyone that was hurt was dead. The muddy truck with yellow letters filled with ice and men came to rest upside down at the foot of a dike just this side of Amlock. Some of us had once again escaped without a scratch. It became necessary to arrange the dead. Casualties were moderate to heavy. Under the remains of the truck was one of them with no head, but on each outstretched wrist there was a watch. I had watched him steal the second watch at China Beach only hours before. I remember wondering why. Even without a head, this one was an easy, positive ID for me. As I had known him for 2 years, this one under the truck was no one special. This was plain Bob Shoemaker, small-time watch thief. After help arrived, I didn't help. I sat and smoked and watched the 2 retrieval teams go about their work. Fire teams out and watched the tree line. The dead, with all their essential parts, were systematically bagged to be sent off to graves registration. The load of ice to the least recognizable shard was salvaged from the muck to be sent on to the compound. Sometimes the dead were in the way and lay half sprawled over a valuable chunk of ice. They were moved, of course. The sergeant in charge of the cleanup crew called it prioritizing the remnants. There was one survivor, though, who didn't like the way things were being done. He was crying, and he gave a speech of sorts while standing knee-deep in the water at the edge of the paddy, a large black Marine with tears running down his cheeks, who shouted into the dead center of the small talk, "A little respect for the dead, fuckheads. These sacks of shit were people, your people, and they ain't coming back." and I, at least, felt properly rebuked.
Mm.
I think one of the extraordinary things about that poem is the way one kind of language plays off against another right at the end. You have fuckheads, and then you have properly rebuked, and they come from quite different places. Properly rebuked seems so formal, even kind of Englishy, and obviously the other is colloquial in the extreme. I think that the poem therefore becomes both an act of witnessing and a way in which the poet challenges himself. He wants, in some sense, refuge. He wants not to be involved. He wants not to be responsible. By the end of the poem, I think he realizes that he is, that he has to be in some ways responsible. He has to tell this story. He says, I was there, I saw this, I wrote this poem. And you should see it, you should think about it. He wrote that poem in an introductory creative writing class at Williams. That's quite extraordinary.
Wow. Yeah, wow.
I'll read the poem that I mentioned that came from an assignment. Unfortunately, I can't really remember exactly what the assignment was that Stephen and I did. I think we both did it. And it had something to do with writing a poem about objects, and maybe like, what if objects saw things? What would they see? How would they respond? And the objects in my poem are, in a sense, witnesses in the way we talked about. We have just now been talking about poems as acts of witnessing. The poem is called Objects Have the Longest Memories of All. Don't be fooled by their stillness, their acquiescence to your touch, their apparent lack of interest in that table or shelf or window looking out on its vacant prospect. Repetition has scarred them, the way a few weeks alone in the dark might loosen you from yourself, turn you into what you were certain you could never become. Consider what they must have witnessed and now are keeping to themselves, the hours of interrogation, the false confessions, the letting go, and outside spiky barricades abandoned in the streets. And this would only be the smallest part of the history of their silence. Those coils of wire, that unbroken watch on a dead man's wrist. Unfasten it. It will tell you nothing but the time of day.
Nice, really nice. So we have 8 more minutes. So I just want to make sure that if you have another poem or so, we could do that, or we could do a little more Q&A if you'd like that.
I'm happy to do either, but if anybody has a question, please.
Anybody questions or forever hold your peace? What are those? No?
Okay. Well, that's fine too. I'll read another poem then. I was interested. I hadn't intended that poem to link to Scotty's poem, which does through the watches. But it's also links back to the False Dawn poem. In that poem, repetition is a way of organizing the world, of granting oneself a kind of comfort even. In this poem, in this last poem, repetition was quite different. I'll find a moment. It becomes a scar. Repetition has scarred them. That means having seen the horrors that they saw, the tortures that they witnessed, they've seen too much. They've, in that sense, been forced into a kind of silence. So the last poem then I'll read is, I guess, a poem in which I imagine myself witnessing. I imagine myself witnessing the death of a martyr and wondering how I would respond to that. It's called The Saint in the Painting. The title runs into the first line. The saint in the painting keeps a skull on his desk as a symbol of the end of illusion and a peace that follows. While in the many brilliant and savage paintings of that time, martyrs destined to become saints seem to welcome the arrows embedded in their chests, or the flames gathering at their feet, or the knives peeling the skin from their bodies. In the Museum of Great Masters, I wish I were more surprised by how many kinds of pain those artists or the priests who paid them decided we needed to see. So I too might have envied the burning man's refusal to believe fire can take anything real from him. His eyes are lifted above the taunts and jeers of the crowd, his gaze fixed on the endless, unyielding sky. But in time, when loss promises to overwhelm me, as it will, or if I'm seduced by the serenity of that saint observing the skull on his desk, I pray that someone I love will convince me we must cling to this world, even as it resists us, torments, and amazes us every day for the rest of our lives.
Whew. Great one to finish up with.
That's right. I don't know. They are more torment than is in that poem, or in those paintings. So obviously the idea there is, if I had seen that, I mean, the paintings are meant, as I see it in the poem, to convince people to believe, to draw them into the church where they will be released from their ordinary lives in some sense, and be able to look forward to heaven. So I'm wondering, like, well, if I saw the actual martyrdom of the saint, would I be persuaded? And by the end of the poem, I'm thinking, maybe so, but I hope not.
Really nice. No, thank you for being here today. It's just been such a pleasure, and
Well, for me too. Thank you for inviting me.
the latest book is April in the Ruins.
Yep, there it is.
April at the Ruins.
Ruins. Yep.
Okay.
Got it. Saison on the cover. So
Okay. Very good.
at the
Well,
library to order a copy, John.
all right.
Stockbridge Library. To order.
Yeah. Very good. Very good.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. And Larry, thank you again. Fascinating hour. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And I hope I'll see everyone next week. All right.
Okay. Thank you again.
Take care.
Bye.